order. I note that everyone has the right to speak in their own official languages and all the normal housekeeping things that the chair normally says, which I don't have a script for. In which case, Clerk, I will turn it to you to start witness presentations, given that you have
Dr.
the speaking order.
Fisman will be first. Dr. Fisman.
Thank you. And Clerk, how long are the
5 to 6
presentations
minutes
today?
5 to 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Honorable members of the committee, I'm so pleased to be able to speak to you today. It's been approximately 1 year since I last appeared before you, and it has been a year like no other. While we have had many surprises, perhaps most surprising to me is the degree to which this pandemic has met our pre-pandemic expectations of the origins and course of such an event. As predicted, a virulent pandemic emerged at the human-animal interface when an animal virus crossed the species barrier. Our fears focused on a pathogen that combined virulence and transmissibility, and SARS-CoV-2 has done that par excellence as well. The contours of this pandemic, both in terms of timing and societal disagreement around masks and business and school closures, also directly echo the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. I'm sure that many of you, like me, wish that we were further along in vaccinating all Canadians against SARS-CoV-2. As with the control of the pandemic itself, Canada is neither at the front nor the back of the pack. We are getting there. Long-term care facilities across the country are largely vaccinated, and that has led to a marked reduction in daily deaths from SARS-CoV-2. But as a friend recently remarked, Canada doesn't have a let's finish in the middle of the pack program for the Olympics. We haven't owned the podium program. We have the smarts and the resources to be at the front of the pack. I think better performance in a crisis like this depends on strong systems, which unfortunately can't be created overnight. As they say, it's hard to build the airplane when you're trying to land it. Public health funding in Canada may be a victim of its own success. When public health systems are functioning well, they are silent, but they allow other sectors of our economy to thrive. Unfortunately, the conditions that created our current pandemic will not disappear when this is over. Environmental degradation, climate change, illicit trade in wildlife, and risky laboratory work are all likely to continue, making a recurrence of a similar event fairly likely. As such, I'd like to look forward rather than backward and talk about what we might build out of this experience in order to protect Canadians in the event of a future severe pandemic, with a focus on vaccination. Vaccines are the door out of the current crisis for the simple reason that it isn't the virus that creates a pandemic, but rather widespread susceptibility to a new virus. Vaccines remove that vulnerability. The frustrations related to COVID-19 reflect weaknesses in two major areas, neither of which appeared overnight and neither of which can be resolved with a snap of the fingers. First, vaccination data systems across the country are weak or non-existent. And second, while we have a rich history of vaccine-related innovation in Canada, the path from innovation to commercialization seems to be a challenging one, and our ability to manufacture vaccines in Canada is limited. In discussions with colleagues, it has emerged that notwithstanding spending around $500 million annually on vaccines, we lack national or even well-functioning provincial appointment systems, vaccine registries, and adverse event surveillance systems. We even lack common terminology across provinces to create such systems. These systems are now being built per force during a national crisis, and they need to be strengthened, integrated, and maintained when the pandemic is over, both because they'll allow us to immunize more efficiently and effectively in peacetime, I'll call it, and also because they'll be a key strategic asset when the next pandemic occurs. Similarly, delays in acquisition of vaccine supply underscore the importance of building strong manufacturing capacity for vaccines here in Canada. The era of vaccine companies as university-owned entities or crown corporations like Connaught is long gone, but we have tremendous innovation in the vaccine space in Canada. The Pfizer-BioNTech mRNA vaccine may represent a new paradigm for partnerships between smaller companies and global vaccine manufacturers, and could provide a pathway for Canadian innovators too. I'm also delighted to see that we will be manufacturing the Novavax COVID-19 vaccine here in Canada soon. A key advantage of partnering with global firms relates to the global nature of communicable diseases. For example, it's important for companies to be able to trial vaccines in other countries where novel SARS-CoV-2 variants are emerging. In closing, this pandemic has made it clear that strong public health systems and vaccines are strategic assets that need to be actively maintained for the protection of Canadians, just as we would maintain a strong and competent military. As with the military, we don't want to be strong so that we can get into fights. We want strength so that we can protect ourselves from threats like SARS-CoV-2 that are likely to continue to emerge in the years ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Fisman. Dr. Weiss, you're up next.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, honorable members of Parliament. I'm very happy to be in front of you this morning. I don't have a formal presentation to give you this morning, but I gave a few slides to the clerk, and I'm sure he will be able to send you my presentation where you will have some data to kind of cover what I will say. I have to say, but I'm talking after my colleague, Dr. David Fisman, but I know well, I completely agree on many different topics. And I just want to underline maybe a few important points here. I would summarize that Canadians did very well throughout this crisis, and I think we have to be very proud of ourselves, because if you look at all the G7 countries in terms of rates and in terms of mortality, we're probably better than many others except Japan, but Japan is a very specific case. But if you compare us to the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Germany, the United States, I think as Canadians, we did very well. People were very disciplined throughout the crisis in general. But I have to say that in terms of our global response as a country, we didn't do that well. And this is where we have a few challenges for the future. So this type of challenges will happen again. I mean, we're in a world where emerging infectious diseases will be I would say, on the menu for the next century. We travel more. We have many ecological issues in terms of deforestation, for example, which is a big thing for emerging infectious diseases, because you have these viruses stuck in the middle of the Amazon jungle, and until you start destroying the forest, you won't be able to see them. We can travel around the world like never before. And we're a country where one of its health, it's its population coming from all over the world. And because of this, we're traveling all over the world. And that's part of our biggest challenge in the future, that we should have like a system in place to be able to limit I would say, the impact of this emerging condition. So there are a few things here. The strength of our system is that we have a federal provincial level, but this is also the weakness of our system, because we had a lot of, I would say, bickering between the different provinces and the federal government in terms of who is responsible for what. And personally, not as a physician, but as a Canadian, what I would expect in the future, I would expect my federal government to step in very quickly and use all its power to try to contain a pandemic like this. And for example, I think we had great military forces. I think I would have seen, and they were deployed up to a certain point. We had the experience of having our armed forces in Quebec, but I think having the potential and the availability of having our soldiers helping the Canadian population with its logistics whenever that was possible, that would have been great. And I think there are examples around the world in terms of immunization, for example, where the Army played a very important role in terms of logistics. Closing the border also was a big thing. And I understand that, and from a political standpoint, it was very difficult. It was like probably the biggest challenge we had as a nation since the last World War. And from that perspective, for all of us who were born after 1945, and even for the others who were probably like children during the Second World War, there hasn't been any challenge as big as this one in our lifetime. And it's extremely difficult to go from an ordinary life to an extraordinary life very quickly. So from that perspective, I think having in place all the measures to be able to close the border quickly, to implement certain rules quickly in terms of isolating people, quarantines, etc., it will be very important. The biggest challenge, and that's our only way to get out of this, is really what I would call the reindustrialization of the Canadian economy, which is mostly for medical equipment. We had to struggle for masks, for ventilators, for tests, very simple things. We're testing hundreds of thousands of people every day in this country, but you have to realize that all the equipment needed for the test are very difficult to get. They're coming from abroad for many of them, and sometimes you need a plastic pipette, which was not available in this country, and we had to fight and compete with the rest of the world to get them. So I think that strategically, a country like ours should be able to kind of muster this in the future and make sure we won't be caught a second time without an industrial base to be able to do this. The second thing, which is really important, and I think I will
Dr. Weiss, I'm just going to let you know you have about 45 seconds left.
Okay. And the second thing, which is very important for me, and I'll just emphasize what David just said, it's really the vaccine, I would say, capability of this country. We lost part of our capability. We just have to rebuild it and regain it. And I think that will be very important for the future, not just for infectious condition, but mRNA vaccines will be used for cancer at one point. And this is why it's important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And just for colleagues, per Dr. Weiss's comments that he has presented some slides to the clerk, they haven't been translated yet. And it's my understanding that they will be translated and circulated in both official languages once that's complete. So just as an FYI. I noticed that Ms. Ravon has joined us, and I'm very looking forward to her testimony on International Women's Day. You have an inadvertent female chair at the moment. So with that, 6 minutes to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and happy International Women's Day to you all. So thank you for the invitation to appear on behalf of the People's Vaccine Alliance. As you may know, OXEM is one of the founding members of this growing movement of health and humanitarian organizations, past and present world leaders, health experts, and economists, and we're calling for a COVID-19 vaccine to be made available for all people in all countries and free of charge. So we know that COVID-19 knows no borders and has impacted everyone's life. Canadians from coast to coast to coast are hurting. But we also know that the pandemic has hit certain groups harder than others. Here in Canada, Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, women with disabilities, and immigrant women have been hardest hit by the virus. And in many cities, they have the highest infection rates. This is because so many of these women are frontline healthcare workers or work in what we now recognize as essential jobs. This is why OXEM has labeled the coronavirus the inequality virus, to emphasize just how much COVID-19 is deepening and exacerbating existing inequalities. The pandemic has demanded interventions on a scale and scope not seen in decades. Canada has invested unprecedented levels of resources to provide a safety net for people here in Canada, but it's also offered significant support to help developing countries weather this storm. This includes close to $940 million to support equitable access to COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines through the WHO Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. This funding also includes $325 million for the COVAX Advanced Markets Commitment Stream, which aims to help vaccinate 20% of people in 92 low and middle income countries, especially the most at-risk groups. Unfortunately, at current trends, 9 out of 10 people in low-income countries will miss out on a COVID-19 vaccine this year. And estimates show that poorer countries will not have widespread vaccination programs in place until 2024. We need to do better. The longer the virus is around, the more likely it is to mutate, making current immunization efforts ineffective. The WHO initiatives that Canada is supporting are important, but unfortunately, they do not tackle the global problem of vaccine shortages. They're also undermined by wealthy countries cutting bilateral supply deals that drive up prices and limit supplies. Our best chance of us all staying safe is to ensure COVID-19 vaccines are available for us all as a global common good. This will only be possible if we change the way vaccines are produced and distributed. Pharmaceutical companies need to allow COVID-19 vaccines to be produced as widely as possible by sharing vaccine technology free from intellectual property rights. We need to maximize production so that enough doses are available for the world to achieve herd immunity. What's fantastic is that Canada can help end the scramble for vaccines. Canada became the co-chair of the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment Engagement Group this past January. In her role as co-chair, Minister Gould can strengthen COVAX by pushing for increased transparency and inviting developing countries and civil society representatives to decision-making spaces. Canada should refrain from procuring vaccines from COVAX at this time. For many low-income countries, COVAX may be their one and only chance of receiving vaccines this year. Ghana and Ivory Coast received their first vaccine shipments this past week through COVAX. This is worth celebrating as a first step to ensuring that their healthcare workers have the protection they need to do their jobs safely. Unfortunately, close to 80 other countries have yet to receive a single dose. The world needs more vaccines and fast. This week, Canada has the opportunity to change the course of the pandemic. A waiver on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, otherwise known as TRIPS, is being brought to a vote at the World Trade Organization. Spearheaded by South Africa and India, and supported by more than 100 countries, this waiver would be a game changer for increasing vaccine supplies, as it would allow countries with the manufacturing capacity to make COVID-19 vaccines. We hope to see Canada vote in favor. This pandemic has shown us how interconnected we all are, and how vital it is to have international cooperation and solidarity. By voting in favor of a TRIPS waiver at the WTO this week, Canada can help stop the pandemic in its tracks. So thank you on behalf of Oxfam and the People's Vaccine Alliance for the opportunity to appear today.
And thank you for your time and your work. And with that, to our last witness in this panel, I turn it to Ms. Desmarais. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, honorable members of the committee. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today. My name is Agathe Desmarais. I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit. So in January, we published a study presenting our forecasts for global coronavirus vaccination timelines around the world. And I think this is the study that Lauren Ravon mentioned in her testimony. These projections presented a time when each country around the world can expect to have vaccinated 60 to 70% of its population. There are 3 main conclusions that I'll present now before digging a little further into the data. The first conclusion is that vaccination will take a lot of time. Vaccinating the majority of the world's population will take until at least late 2022. And for many countries, the timelines will stretch until 2024 if vaccination happens at all. The second conclusion is that production is the main bottleneck around the world. We studied 7 criteria to make our timelines, and production was always the one that made timelines slip. And the third conclusion is that this poses 2 main risks. The first risk is for the global economic recovery, because some countries will recover faster than others because they will have vaccinated faster than others. And the second risk is obviously that while not everyone is vaccinated, new variants of the coronavirus pandemic can emerge and could take us back to square one. So first, why did we do this study and what was our methodology? Well, until recently, the main variable for political and economic forecasts that we do at the EAU, it was the course of the pandemic. It's not the case anymore. No, it's all about global vaccination timelines. What was our methodology? Briefly, we took 7 factors into account. The first one was production. As I've mentioned, it's the main bottleneck because 15% of the world's population has pre-booked around half of the supplies of coronavirus vaccines that will be produced this year. The second factor was supply deals. The third factor was logistics, with a special focus on 2 issues: transportation, which is going to be very tricky because normally vaccines are shipped via passenger planes, but there's no travel anymore because of travel restrictions. And the second subfactor was the cold chain, because some countries do not have the required cold chain to use some of the vaccines that require ultra-low temperatures. The fourth factor was the availability of healthcare personnel to administer the vaccines, and this is going to be a bottleneck in some countries, for instance, in Asia. Financing is also another factor, the fifth factor, crucial for many poorer countries. The sixth factor was vaccine hesitancy, especially acute in some countries like France, Japan, or Argentina. And finally, some local factors, because some countries simply do not want to vaccinate. This is the case in Tanzania, for instance. Second thing that I wanted to mention, what are the main takeaways from our study? Well, we mapped 4 different categories of countries. The first category is the fastest countries, with timelines stretching into late 2021, so late this year. We have exceptionally fast countries such as Israel, the United Kingdom, Serbia, or the Gulf countries, and other very fast countries in the EU, the US, Switzerland, Hong Kong, or Singapore, for instance. The second category of country have timelines stretching into mid-2022. This is still very good by global standards. These are other OECD advanced countries such as Australia, Japan, or South Korea, or middle-income countries that have production capacity such as Brazil, Russia, or Mexico. The third category of countries, it's where we found most middle-income countries and India and China, with timelines stretching into late 2022. Why India or China are taking until late 2022? Because of the sheer size of their population, which is going to present a big challenge, and also because these countries are exporting vaccines in large quantities. So they will find tensions between supplying their domestic markets and supplying exports. And finally, the fourth and last category, where the majority of the world's population is finding itself, is timelines stretching in 2023 and beyond if vaccination even takes place. So this is the rest of the world, mainly low-income countries, and includes most countries that will depend on COVAX, which will cover only 20% of the population of eligible countries with timelines that are non-binding and subject to change. And there's a real risk in these countries that vaccination will not take place, because in some of these developing countries, governments could find that vaccination could be too costly or too difficult. Finally, what does that mean for the global economic recovery, which is something that we forecast at the EAU? Well, it will start from the third quarter of 2021, so the third quarter of this year, because it's the time when the US, Europe, many OECD countries will have vaccinated the bulk of their population. China is the engine of global growth, but vaccination timelines can stretch further because the pandemic is under control in China. So there is no real rush in China to vaccinate, which is quite different from the situation in many Western countries. That being said, the global economy will recover to pre-coronavirus GDP levels only in late 2021, so it will take time. And this forecast masks wide disparities. It's artificially boosted by China, where we forecast that growth will boom this year. But for the US, the EU, well, will we see a recovery to pre-coronavirus GDP levels only in 2022, or in Japan in 2023? In emerging countries, timelines will be much slower for a recovery, which reflects the slow vaccination timelines that we've just discussed and the lack of fiscal space to launch stimulus plans. And this poses 2 main risks, finally, for a global economic recovery. The first one is that global vaccination timelines could slip even further, which would delay the recovery. And the second one is, as I've mentioned, while not everyone is vaccinated, we could see new variants that could prove resistant to vaccines could emerge. Thank you very much for your attention and having me today.
Thank you very much to the witnesses. Now, I believe our chair has figured out how to get onto the meeting.
Yes, I believe so. Thank you, Ms. Menkel-Garner.
Great. And so, Chair, I will pass it over to you on this International Women's Day, which seems apropos. And it will be Mr. McGuire from the Conservatives for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you indeed. And of course, congratulations to everyone on this International Women's Day. So yes, please, Mr. McGuire, please go ahead. 6 minutes, please.
In emerging countries, timelines will be much slower for a recovery, which reflects the slow
Yes, thank you.
Chair, you do have your
unmuted.
TV on in the background.
Yes, thank you. I'll straighten that out.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, chairs. I want to thank the witnesses for their presentations today. Most relevant and interesting the situation that's faced before us here right now. I want to ask Ms. Desmarais, you've done this huge study, the Global Intelligence Unit, and we've got an awful lot of, you're talking there about the recoveries in 2021 for China, 2022 for the US, 23 and beyond for the emerging countries. But in regards to the forecasted pandemic long-term impacts on sort of things more probably in Canada, but probably relevant to other areas of the world as well, in commercial real estate, do you know how these the pandemic so far has impacted some of these commercial real estate markets around the world? And I'm looking at a very relevant question to follow that up with.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to reply that yes, indeed, the pandemic has had an impact on commercial real estate. I'm afraid I haven't prepared anything on this topic today, so it would be hard pressed to give a definitive answer. I apologize about this.
That's fine. I guess I'm looking at major concerns about working people and people working from home and the impact of that on the economy. I don't know if you have anything in that regard. You're looking at some pretty different timelines in different areas of the world in as far as the economic recovery goes, but the change in people being able to work at home, is that something that you can comment on? And how will that impact the real estate market is basically what I'm looking at, whether it's commercial or even households, changing of home values.
Thank you very much. So to answer your question, I think that the question is about the future of cities. I would phrase it this way: with commercial real estate, perhaps with some offices downsizing space. I think this is a possibility, but at the same time, we can see actually that things could go in any direction. We could see that people would want to go back to the office. It's certainly the case in some countries. Actually, it depends really country by country. In other countries, we've seen people who have actually fled cities to try to work remotely from other locations. So I would say it's going to be a case-by-case situation. In terms of the timelines for recovery, as you've mentioned, we're looking at early 2022 for the US and Europe to go back to pre-coronavirus GDP levels. So it's going to take time. Canada is actually in the same timelines. But I would say so far it's a bit too early to make definitive forecasts about the future of work. It's a very open debate. I would say that it's something that we'll certainly monitor very precisely.
To you and Mr. Ravon as well, regards to the number of vaccines getting out to people, you're saying that the production is always one of the 7 criteria, but one of the very key issues that allows timelines to slip. Can you comment further on that in the impact that even if a country like Canada, as small as population as we are, gets completely vaccinated, if these other areas of the world aren't vaccinated till 2023, 2024, and I noted you said emerging countries, if at all, this virus is still then very valid or very alive and well across the rest of the world. How do we deal with that? What's the best way to deal with the impact of that?
Well, that's a great question. And I think there's 2 parts to the answer. One is just on the medical side of things. We know that the disease is mutating, that the longer we wait to vaccinate everyone, the more we all are at risk in terms of changing to invariants and making us less safe here in Canada. So even if we do get vaccinated, if the world is slow to vaccinate the entire population, we are at risk. But then perhaps even more importantly, as long as the global economy doesn't recover, our economy won't recover. Things like travel will remain disrupted, global supply chains will remain disrupted, and also perhaps most importantly, the global fight against poverty will continue to go back. We are losing ground day by day.
Just because of time, Ms. Desmarais, could you?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that the main risk to me, in addition to what Mrs. Ravon has said, I think the main risk to me is that a number of emerging countries could well lose the motivation to vaccinate, I think, if they find that this is too costly or too tricky, or if production remains a big bottleneck. So I think this is the main risk.
So how should Canada best deal with this?
I do not believe that it is my place to make some recommendations to Canada. I think that our study was taking a look at global vaccination timelines.
Yeah, countries like Canada. Then I mean, we're connected to the United States. We're so close here. Major part of major continent in the world. Have you anything in regards to?
I'd be happy to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead then.
I think there's two things. I think what we're already doing, supporting COVAX to get vaccinations out and fast, is a great first step. But the second step, as I mentioned, is waiving international intellectual property rights, because right now time is of the essence. We just need to ramp up production. There's no other way around it. And until we open up intellectual property rights on these vaccines, we won't be able to ramp up production to get people vaccinated.
Okay. And Ms. Desmarais as well, the pandemic has caused many countries to run deficits all over the world. We know that it's costing our economies and treasury hundreds of millions of dollars a day. What are your predictions in regards to inflation and currency devaluations becoming a problem soon, if not already here?
So our forecast is that the main risk to the global economy, obviously the coronavirus pandemic and everything related to vaccines, but also a spike in inflation. That's a risk. It's not our baseline scenario, but if inflation were to spike because of a spike in global demand, once the global economy recovers, well, that would be a definitive risk, because it would make repaying debt very, very tricky. So at the moment, it's not our baseline forecast, but it's certainly something that is worth monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. I believe that's your time. We will go now to, I believe it's Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher, please go ahead. 6 minutes.
Mr. Van Bijnen.
Mr. Chair, I believe this next slot's for me.
Sorry, I apologize, Mr. Van Bijnen. Please go ahead.
No problem. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to start by thanking our witnesses for joining us today. And I do also want to wish everyone a happy International Women's Day. Dr. Fishman, I share with you the view that we need to learn from this situation, and we need to start thinking about what we should be doing working forward. You're based in Ontario, and you've been working with the provincial governments on the vaccine rollout. From your perspective, can you talk about the work that provincial governments need to do in order to ensure that currently we have a rapid and an efficient vaccine rollout?
So just to be clear, I don't have a role on the Ontario vaccine task force at all. I'm on the science table in Ontario and the modeling table, and I can give you my perspective as someone who's more looking at data rather than designing systems. But I can also, I think, possibly make a comment as a physician. I think to my mind, we're doing some good stuff. The marvelous observation over the last month or so is we've had long-term care facilities in Ontario serve as a major source of death during this pandemic. And the Pfizer vaccine and then the Moderna vaccine have basically shut that down. And our science table has a brief that came out today looking at the impact of these vaccines in long-term care. It's nothing short of spectacular. I think that if there's a major failing that I see in Ontario that's holding us back, and I think we are starting to fail to keep up with vaccine supply as it comes into the province. We have about 9,000 family doctors in this province who vaccinate a few million Ontarians against influenza every flu season. And I'm aware of the logistical issues with the mRNA vaccines, but we're starting to get into vaccines that don't have the same extreme cold requirements for storage. I think family doctors know how to do this. They know their patients, they know how to prioritize, and they know how to get folks vaccinated. I think there are some infection control concerns in terms of individual people's offices, and not all docs feel comfortable having a large crowd of folks pass through at this time. But I do think that that's probably, as we try to do something new, I think we have to use the tools that we already have in our toolbox. And we do have this group of individuals who are very, very good at vaccination who have been underutilized to date. So I hope that changes. I think the thing I'm proudest of in terms of the Ontario Science Table, and it's brought me along a little bit, is usually, and we see this every year with influenza vaccine, usually the dilemma with vaccination is that vaccines are least good at protecting the individuals you most want them to protect. So with influenza each year, most deaths from influenza each year occur in individuals over age 65. for whom traditional influenza vaccines, we've got some better ones now, but traditionally influenza vaccines have arguably not worked at all in that demographic. So we've directly tried to protect individuals with vaccines that are very unlikely to work in that age group, whereas we could probably protect them more effectively by going for the herd, because the flu vaccines work in younger people. We don't actually have that dilemma with COVID vaccines, because the mRNA vaccines in particular are so potent that we can directly protect individuals over age 80, over age 70, individuals with underlying medical issues by directly vaccinating them. So to some extent, this decision's been a bit of a no-brainer in terms of who do you vaccinate first. It's older people, and I think you see that in other countries. The modification to that that's come out of our science table is there's this observation that about 90% of all of our COVID cases come from 10% of our postal codes in Ontario. And those have been overwhelmingly postal codes that are more densely populated urban areas, lots of people of color, lots of new Canadians, lots of folks involved in essential work. So what came out of the science table, and I think the province is now following this, is an attempt to sort of front load, in addition to prioritizing older people and folks with underlying medical conditions, to try to front load vaccination in some of these zip codes that have been really the hardest hit, to try to get some of those herd effects as well. And I think it's a neat piece of nuance. I realize it's raised equity concerns in other areas where people have said, hey, what about us over here? We're vulnerable too. But I think these are hard decisions with a scarce resource, and I think they did pretty well with that.
A lot of these decisions are database, Dr. Fishman. So I'm hoping you can expand on the tools that are available to the provinces and the territories, such as testing, contact tracing, public health measures that would get us through this crisis, and the importance of data and how data can help lead the decisions that we need to effectively counter the effects of this pandemic.
Right. So I think increasingly public health has become a data-focused discipline. I mean, how we understand processes, how we see them, really depends on the data that we have. It's unfortunate. I think, in my province in Ontario, we have a bit of a track record where we've sunk billions of dollars into data systems, and famously have had very little to show for that. So I think that is sort of a caution to us as we say, let's just throw a bunch of money at this and build some good data systems. We have needs on a bunch of different fronts. In terms of public health surveillance systems, we could really use some upgrades that make surveillance systems interactive, kind of have crosstalk across the country, shared vocabulary, sort of relatively user-friendly data systems, and data systems that are actually linked into, we have national healthcare in Canada. It would be great if we could actually have interactivity between our public health data systems and our healthcare data systems. On the subject of vaccines in particular, because that's sort of what I had been thinking about heading into this meeting, we are really, really patchy and have very little that's been constructed to date. As far as I know, the only province in Canada, and I hope I'm right about this, is that has an adult vaccine registry is Prince Edward Island. I think that's it. So we really don't know. As I mentioned in my remarks, we spend $500 million annually on vaccines, but we actually have no means of tracking who got them, linking that to health records so that we could look and see, if you're vaccinated, are you less likely to be hospitalized and so forth. We're really struggling in terms of appointment systems. We don't have a good national nimble system to monitor vaccine adverse effects, which is a really big issue with brand new vaccines.
I'm going to have to cut you off right there.
Sure, sorry.
So thank you very much. Excellent information. We go now, nous allons maintenant à Monsieur Thériault.
We'll now turn to Mr. Thériault. Mr. Thériault, please go ahead. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. And thank you to our witnesses for coming to appear before us today and for taking your time to testify. It's highly informative and highly relevant. We're faced with a global pandemic. And Ms. Desmarais and Ms. Raven's testimony was very eloquent and pointed to this fact. does the model that is currently in place, Dr. Fisher, Dr. Weiss, your scientists, you said that we need more centralized coordination, but first and foremost, shouldn't there have been a global approach to coordination? We're dealing with vaccination protectionism here now, which has led to a vaccine race. And really, if you look at Doctors Without Borders and Ms. Raven and Ms. Desmarais' findings, it's incumbent upon us to revise the way we handle ourselves in the face of a global pandemic, especially given that variants will always be a potential threat and may lead us back to square one. So this is an old problem. The countries of the third world are often left by the wayside, excluded. So, Dr. Fishman and Dr. Weiss, I'd like to hear your opinions on this issue. Response. Well, Mr. Theriault, let me respond to you as best I can. We're dealing with a virus here that's going to last and hang around for quite some time. It has a non-human reservoir, and so we may end up with a virus such as rabies that we vaccinated. It won't be necessarily fully vaccinated, and we'll have to deal with it for some time. We'll need vaccines like we have for the flu, which will need to be used on a regular basis, and we may have to revaccinate people every year, every 2 years, across the world to protect them against new variants. And what you also need to understand is that these variants are not unexpected. It's a way for the virus to adapt to the human species, to mutate. So a variant isn't necessarily a worse variety. It's like a cake, for example. There's a whole bunch of recipes that were unsuccessful, and what do we end up with? We end up with the final recipe that is successful, and that's the case with the virus. The World Health Organization, like many large organizations of the kind, failed in their task. They were subject to a number of political pressures. They weren't very transparent and clear as far as the scope of the pandemics, especially in China. And it was only after the fact that we really understood just how big this pandemic was. We were able to sequence the pandemic from Australia. Folks had come to Australia via China. From China, rather. So we can't rely on international organizations for full transparency because individual nations aren't fully transparent. So really, in Canada, in Quebec, we have to protect ourselves. We have to have in our toolkit everything that we need to protect Canadians and Quebecers as best we can under the circumstances. Of course, we can cooperate with other countries, and we need to do so, especially when we lack capacity here in Canada for certain products and equipment. And vaccines are a key example of that. So the proof is in the pudding. Now, as far as the future is concerned, in Canada, we need a really fail-proof screening process. We have a provincial and national laboratory network and system in Winnipeg, which is recognized on the world stage. But we also need an early warning and monitoring and oversight system that will allow us to detect threats in quick order and so that we can put in place measures to combat those issues automatically and across the board. So I think everyone agrees that it's difficult to build the plane mid-flight. It's quite clear that we were caught off guard in many respects when it comes to putting in place all of these measures to effectively and efficiently combat the virus. In other words, we need Canadian vaccine production capacity in order to vaccinate the whole population. We could discuss this at length, but from a practical standpoint, we are dealing with global competition and also the European Union, for example, which is a grouping of countries. Everyone wants to keep the vaccine for themselves. China is also producing vaccine. There are geostrategic considerations. Vaccines are there should be more vaccines delivered to poorer countries, but often it's an exchange for something. There's an expectation of getting something in return. But in any event, we need greater collaboration. Question. So we need, given the skills that we have back here at home, we need to rebuild our capacity. Very quickly, you were very highly critical of AstraZeneca. Are you in favour of a vaccine that is tailored to various and different age groups? And what is your criticism of AstraZeneca based on? There's a whole slew of studies that are coming through the pipeline when it comes to vaccine efficacy. Response. Well, I was critical based on the current data, which states that the AstraZeneca vaccine is potentially less effective as other vaccines that are based on RN messengers. The AstraZeneca vaccine isn't a bad vaccine per se, but you have to understand that it's been much less used than the other vaccines. And one of the problems is that in the Canadian society, there's a certain segment of the society which is reluctant and concerned about various vaccine safety. We've seen very few issues to do with vaccine safety, however. So we need to encourage vaccination. AstraZeneca has been called less effective for folks over 65 and in relation to the South African variant and strain. But without getting into too much technical detail, if there was absolutely no other alternative to the AstraZeneca vaccine, I'd be the first to say that I'd love to get that vaccine immediately. But given the backdrop, i.e. that we have vaccines that seem to be far more efficacious, then, and if I had a choice, well, of course, I would choose the vaccine that seems to be more effective. You can see in Israel's vaccinated over 80% of its population with a massive drop in the number of cases, especially in the senior population.
Merci.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Thériault.
Mr. Davies, and I'll give you a little bit of extra time also. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Rayvon, Oxfam Canada is on record as saying that Canada should use its leadership to encourage G7 countries to stop supporting pharmaceutical corporations' monopolies on COVID-19 vaccines. Oxfam has stated that breaking up the monopolies of the big pharmaceutical companies is the quickest, fairest, and most effective way of boosting vaccine production so that countries are not forced to compete for scarce and limited doses. There's an important vote coming up this Wednesday at the WTO. Has the Government of Canada indicated whether it will support the proposed temporary IP waiver at the upcoming WTO Council on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights?
So I obviously can't speak for the Government of Canada. All I can say is that we're hoping to see Canada take a strong stand and support the waiver of the TRIPS. And this is because ultimately it's just a matter of scale. We need to be producing vaccines everywhere we can, in every country we can, in every lab that can produce them. And at this moment in time, if we're dependent on some pharmaceutical countries, then vaccination could be delayed for 3-4 years, or even, as Madame Desmarais has said, some countries could simply decide to forego vaccination. If you look at some of the vaccines today, it costs almost $40 for a 2-dose vaccine. Poor countries are not going to be able to pay that for their entire population. So we're hoping that Canada will say yes to a temporary waiver.
Thank you. Offhand, do you have any idea, Ms. Rayvon, or maybe even you, Madame Desmarais, what percentage of the investment that produced COVID vaccines was publicly financed?
My understanding is up to 80% of research and development expenses were publicly financed, but I can turn to Madame Desmarais. I think that's usually the case, and we need to understand this is not normal circumstances. These are extraordinary circumstances, and so that's why we need to take extraordinary measures.
I think that my understanding is that this varied greatly vaccine by vaccine, so it's hard to make an average, but I've heard the figure of 80% for some vaccines in some countries.
Thank you. Ms. Rayvon, we've talked about the COVAX, and it's now, I would say, infamous that Canada is securing 1.9 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine from the COVAX program this June. Recent news by my math shows that the government of Canada now claims to have secured delivery of 117.9 million vaccine doses by the end of September, which is enough to vaccinate every single Canadian 3 times over. Is it justifiable for Canada to be taking 1.9 million doses from the COVAX program, given those numbers and given what you've told us about the lack of doses in the developing world?
So to be clear, we think that Canada should not be taking doses from COVAX. That being said, we think there's a bigger problem of production. So even if we didn't take those million plus doses, we still don't solve the problem for the world. And there's no way that even once we're vaccinated in Canada, that we can go fast enough to vaccinate everyone else with the doses available now. So that's why really our focus today is on ramping up production and opening up intellectual property rights so that in developing countries who have the capacity to produce, they're doing it. The problem with the current system is that someone like me, a young woman who's perfectly healthy, will be vaccinated before a healthcare worker in a developing country who is on the front lines of the disease. And so that's why we need to shift things around. It's not a bidding war, who pays the most to get the vaccine, but that the vaccines are distributed according to need and vulnerability. And that's not how things are working today. And there's an easy answer to this around intellectual property rights.
Thank you. Madame Desmarais, last week the European Union blocked a shipment of the AstraZeneca vaccine destined for Australia after the drug manufacturer failed to meet its EU contract commitments. According to Reuters, the EU is also planning to extend this export authorization scheme for COVID-19 vaccines to the end of June. You were quoted in a BBC article, Madame Desmarais, saying, as long as the European market doesn't have enough vaccines, I think that big imports to Canada are going to remain off the cards. Do you expect that future vaccine deliveries to Canada may be disrupted by EU export controls?
So I think that what this highlights is the production issue that Mrs. Raven has just mentioned. I think that it's unprecedented around the world that everybody wants to have a vaccine at the same time. So this is really making the issue a production one, and it's really going to be difficult this year to produce enough vaccines for everyone. Then there's a political issue. Obviously, a number of countries are prioritizing vaccinating their domestic population first because they are under intense political pressure to do so, especially in Western countries. In the European Union, all the debates in all the newspapers at the moment are all about whether the vaccine rollout is fast enough. In this situation, it's very hard to imagine that the European Union will allow the exports of vaccines in very large quantities abroad in the coming months. As you've mentioned, Italy has blocked some shipments of AstraZeneca vaccines to Australia. So it's not impossible to imagine that this could happen again. And again, this really highlights 2 issues. The first one is production. There is a need to ramp up production to be able to vaccinate everyone this year. That's not going to be possible. And the second one is that this has become a very, very political topic.
I guess to all witnesses, it seems a very clear theme is coming up that we're allowing a handful of private multinational corporations in the world to control the production of a vaccine that is needed by 7 billion people around the world. Given that most of the money that went into developing the vaccine was not their risked capital, but it was publicly financed, does anybody disagree that we should be temporarily changing the way that we protect intellectual property so that every country can produce vaccines by making the technology and the intellectual property globally and publicly accessible? Does anybody think that's a bad idea?
I mean, I'll be the contrarian. I think it's a difficult challenge. I don't think it's a good idea or a bad idea. I think the reason it's a challenge is because one can see arguing this in the short term very much in favor of trying to just expand global vaccine supply as fast as possible. And I understand that. And I think we've had precedent for that with HIV drugs previously, where drugs have gone off, where drugs have been, I believe, manufactured in India, even while on patent, in violation of patents, because it was an emergency. So I think there's precedent. That said, I actually, I'm gonna go out on a bit of a limb here and say that I think that these vaccine multinationals, which are massive companies, and you see that manifest in their names, as GlaxoSmithKline, Sanofi Pasteur. I mean, there's been this sort of merger mania for about 30 years in the vaccine industry that's resulted in these very, very large players. But those players are actually, a lot of them are filling an important global role. Manufacturing vaccines this is not 1910 in Toronto where you buy a stable and you harvest serum from horses. The quality issues, the potential liability issues, and the fact that it costs about $1 billion a vaccine to bring a vaccine to market makes this a challenging business and sort of has sort of pushed it towards very large players.
Yeah.
And there are advantages of that.
Doctor, could you wrap up, please?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think what you want to do is you want to try to increase supply rapidly without sort of making this an unattractive area for companies to work in future. Because I'd love it if we could circle back around to what our future challenges are. Because COVID is going to be done in some time. We're going to get through this, whether we vaccinate or don't vaccinate. Pandemics end, but we have a whole list of pathogens that can do exactly the same thing as COVID has done, and we need vaccines against those pathogens too, which is a problem because it's hard to make these things when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. But if we're making them in the middle of a pandemic, we're too late.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Mr. Davies. So that brings us to the end of this panel and the questions. And I would like to thank all the witnesses for sharing your time with us today and your expertise. Thank you for your great answers. And with that, we will suspend and bring in the next panel. We are suspended.
Doctor.
So we are resuming meeting number 23 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health. We are meeting today to study the emergency situation facing Canadians in light of the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like to welcome the witnesses. For this panel, we have Dr. Yves Dubé, researcher, Research Center, Université de Laval, Dr. Nathalie Grandvaux, professor. And from Pfizer Canada, we have, Pfizer Canada, Mr. Pinault, President. Thank you. So we will start with witness statements. So Dr. Dubé, if you please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you. So I guess I'm here as a medical anthropologist working on vaccine acceptance. And I'd just like to emphasize that at this time, vaccine supplies does not meet vaccine demand, but that the work that we're doing in Quebec, looking at vaccine intention, indicate that most Canadians are willing to be vaccinated. And we could see vaccine acceptance on a continuum ranging from a very tiny minority of people that are strongly opposed to vaccination. It's less than 2% to the vast majority of people that are willing to be vaccinated. And in the middle, there's the vaccine hesitant, the movable middle. Those groups are a bit more concerned about vaccine and maybe more reluctant to get their vaccination. And that's the group where we're seeing the most public health gains in ensuring confidence and acceptance. So our regular surveys conducted in Quebec are similar to those that are done elsewhere in Canada, and indicate that 3 out of 4 people are willing to be vaccinated. But of course, between an intention and actual behavior, there's a gap, and we need to ensure that barriers to vaccine acceptance are understood and well addressed. And of these, they could be grouped in 3 main categories. So first, complacency. Depending where you live in Canada, if there's no COVID cases around you, might be less willing to get a vaccination. The second one is confidence. It's the level of trust that people have in the public health authorities, the government, to make good decisions in terms of vaccination and ensure information is available to make an informed decision about vaccine. And the last one is convenience. It's something that we tend to overlook, but the easiest to get access to a vaccination, to take an appointment, to be reminded that it's your turn to be vaccinated is also important. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. We go now to Dr. Granville. Dr. Granville, please go ahead. 6 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee and fellow witnesses. So first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. So I'm just to present myself a little bit. I'm a full professor in biochemistry and molecular medicine at Université de Montréal, and I also the director of the research laboratory on host-virus interaction at the Centre de Recherche du CHUM, also in Montreal. And in that matter, I have been studying the mechanism of human defense against respiratory viruses for 15 years now. So, and since April 2020, I'm also the co-director of the Quebec COVID Pandemic Research Network that promote research collaboration to accelerate the discoveries and their applications. So at this point in the pandemic, I believe Canada faces, to my opinion, several critical challenges for the immunization strategy to be successful. There would be plenty to discuss, but as a matter of time, I will only focus on 2 essential elements for which I see major inconsistencies these days and for which I would like to propose avenues of improvement. So first of all, I would like to underline the work of the COVID vaccine task force with their recommendation of a diversified portfolio of vaccines. This was, to my opinion, an informed choice, considering the impossibility of knowing a priori the success of each of these vaccines, and also because of our lack of production capacity. Likewise, the logistic for bringing vaccine doses to the provinces and territories is efficient, and I think this should be emphasized. However, we now have 4 vaccines authorized by PHAC, and this is amazing, but a major problem, however, is the confusion of messages regarding their use, as Canada, to my opinion, does not speak with a single strong voice. So PHAC authorizes vaccines based on the clinical trial data, and the NACI subsequently adjusts the recommendation for their use based on real-life data as it becomes available. It goes without saying that the different messages emitted by these 2 organizations lately induce a major confusion that is incomprehensible by the majority of the population. And this is without taking into account the additional confusion induced by the different opinion of the provincial advisory committees. So we are living an exceptional crisis situation, but the way our organization operates has, to my opinion, not been adjusting accordingly. NACI and PHAC should collaborate more closely and should unite their voice to deliver a single, clear, and cohesive message. It is important to understand that inconsistent message will likely lead to a loss of confidence in the population in the vaccination campaign, and one cannot risk losing the adhesion of the population to immunization with the safe and effective vaccines that we have. I therefore urged the government to review the mandate of NESI and PIAC to include the collaboration to reach a consensus to update the policies. The most important problem, to my opinion, is undoubtedly that NACI's recommendations are not always based on scientific evidence, but in some cases on assumption and experts' opinion. This is particularly striking and worrisome with respect to the change in recommendation for the administration of mRNA vaccine. These vaccines have been evaluated in clinical trial with 2 doses and should be administered after 3 or 4 weeks. There is currently no data demonstrating the consequences of postponing the second dose. NACI now recommends delaying the second dose for up to 4 months, which, by the way, Canada is the only country to recommend this long delay. But there is absolutely no data to support this decision, and to do so without scientific evidence is equivalent of conducting a clinical trial without properly following up the participant and having the consent. So for the sake of transparency, the government of Canada should make NACI's discussion public so that the actual data that was discussed to support the decision, as well as the outcome of committee's member votes, are known. The government should also require that all evidence taken into account in making the decision be made public at the time of recommendation, not weeks later. We currently have no evidence regarding the consequences of delaying the second dose. And finally, real-world data from the UK shows a differential response of individuals after the first dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, depending on the age. From biological measurement carried out in the UK, either from Dr. Gupta's laboratory or the REACT-2 study, some evidence show that the first dose induced a good antibody response for people under age of 69 years, but it is very different for the population over 69, reaching up to 35% only of people over 80 who develop an antibody response, while all the people after the second dose develop an antibody response. So there are therefore serious concerns about the extent of immunization of people over 70 years of age who are currently receiving only 1 dose in Canada. I totally understand that the recommendations are made under the principle of equity in a context of limited supplies of vaccine doses. However, this recommendation may ultimately jeopardize the outcome of the vaccination campaign for the world population if experts' opinions are wrong. The only good response to this situation is to make everything possible to make sure we get doses as quickly as possible and to limit the propagation using sanitary measures during this time. In conclusion, my take-home message is probably that Canadian policy on vaccine administration should evolve in real time, of course, but only based on emerging scientific data. And one thing that is important is that if the data are not available from countries who are leading the mass vaccination, Canada should consider mandating researchers to generate this data to support evidence-based decisions. So I thank you, and I will answer your question en anglais ou en français.
Merci, Doctor. We go now to Mr. Pinault. Mr. Pinault, please go ahead. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, bonjour. My name is Cole Pinault, and I'm the president of Pfizer Canada. It has been 1 year since this pandemic was declared. Since then, Pfizer and BioNTech successfully developed a safe and efficacious vaccine for the prevention of COVID-19 in record time using a novel technology platform. In order to do that, Pfizer invested more than $2 billion at risk. We planned for success and scaled up a very complex supply chain. It requires more than 280 components coming from 86 different suppliers based in 19 different countries. We also established a highly innovative delivery system for a product requiring ultra cold storage and have shipped directly to hundreds of administration sites in Canada. As we gather here, 3 months after Giselle Levesque became the first Canadian to be vaccinated, I'd like to remind you about a small but important part of the effort it took to bring the first vaccine to Canadians as soon as science would allow. In August, we became the 4th country to complete an advance purchase agreement for the vaccine. We secured up to 76 million doses, while many other countries were also looking to lock in supply commitments. In September, Health Canada introduced a rolling submission process that allowed us to file our vaccine data as soon as it became available. We initiated our application in October, and by mid-November, we had made sufficient progress that a regulatory decision in December became a possibility. It wasn't until this time that we realized the need to accelerate both the initial delivery schedule and the province's readiness to administer the vaccine. This was not an easy task. Pfizer, PSPC, PIAC, and the provinces all worked very hard to find a viable path forward so that Canada could be ready. As a result, we became the second major country in the world to receive the vaccine when it arrived on December 14th. This was almost 2 months earlier than originally anticipated. It's a tremendous accomplishment by so many, and we're very proud of this milestone achievement. Following the initial rollout, deliveries were temporarily reduced for 3 weeks as we worked on scaling up our Belgium manufacturing facility. It's important to note that this was a deliberate decision. We purposely chose to slow down production in order to make improvements that help to increase our global annual capacity from 1.3 billion to 2 billion doses. Retooling our Belgium facility was the right thing to do. More vaccines produced, more countries receiving them, and more people immunized. Canadians benefited from these improvements as well. The complexity of both the scale up of our manufacturing facility and our global supply chain is why we insisted that our contractual obligations for delivery be on a quarterly basis. This is not unique to Canada. Pfizer's delivery commitments around the world are on a quarterly basis. We understand that Canadians want to know when they will be protected against the virus. We have gone above and beyond our original contractual obligations in 2 important ways to provide as much certainty as possible. First, we share a rolling weekly forecast as soon as we have confidence in its reliability. Today, the public knows what to minimally expect from now through the middle of April. Second, we are constantly working to accelerate our deliveries. Canadians will now receive 12.75 million doses earlier than our original contract requirement. To date, we have supplied over 2.5 million doses and have never missed a weekly delivery forecast. We remain confident that we will continue to be successful in delivering our forecast going forward. By the end of this month, we will have supplied 5.5 million doses. In Q2, we will have supplied 12.8 million doses. And in Q3, it will be 21.7 million. By the end of September, we will have provided Canadians with 40 million doses. While we are optimistic about what this will mean as we emerge from this pandemic, we also need to reflect on how we can be better prepared for the next one. There are best practices and lessons to be learned. We have a unique opportunity to look back at Canada's pre-pandemic situation with clarity and work together to improve the life sciences sector in this great country. Canadians have a newfound appreciation for the value of a resilient local biopharmaceutical industry. Past efforts to foster the life sciences sector have been undermined by detrimental policies of federal governments for more than a decade. If Canada wants to change course and succeed, it must put a stop to one-way consultations and engage in real dialogue with our industry. We stand ready to have this much-needed conversation and contribute to Canada's future. As I end my remarks, I would like to reiterate that what has been accomplished so far is extraordinary. I express my sincere thanks to the 46,000 clinical trial participants, the hundreds of investigators, and the thousands of Pfizer and BioNTech scientists, clinicians, and manufacturing professionals, many whom have worked day and night knowing that every moment matters. Merci. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pinault. We'll start our questions at this point with Ms. Rempel-Garner. Please go ahead, Ms. Rempel-Garner, 6 minutes.
Thank you. I'll be directing my questions to Mr. Pinault. And Mr. Pinault, I do have 6 minutes, so if you could be brief in your remarks, that would be wonderful. Do you endorse your COVID vaccine as fully effective if the second dose is delayed up to 4 months?
All the research to date on our vaccine has been done with 2 doses that have a schedule of 21 days. The recommendation that's been put in place by NACI, as highlighted earlier in Canada, is the only one in the world which is recommending an extended dose delivery.
Thank you. I'll take that as a no. I'm looking at an article that was published in The Lancet by a group of researchers from the University of Nottingham at the end of February, and it's regarding your vaccine and particularly decisions related to extended dosing. This article argues that the clinical data as well as real-life observational data based on evidence from Israel did not support delaying the second dose of your vaccine past the recommended 3-week interval. Do you agree with this finding?
The data that we've seen from a real world evidence perspective that has been used to make arguments to extend the dose schedule has been done on much younger populations. The fact is we don't have any data after 2 months to know what the impact of one dose will be.
This article also states that, quote, suboptimal vaccination will create selective pressure facilitating the emergence of vaccine-resistant variants, which could result in a persisting pandemic. And this, of course, is in the context of a delayed dosing schedule. Has your company conducted any research, or would they agree with the finding that an incomplete vaccination or a significantly delayed dosing schedule could potentially lead to the creation of vaccine-resistant variants?
All of the research we're doing today on variants, and again, I'm happy to go into detail if you'd like on that subject, but all of our research to date is with patients that have received our dose 21 days apart from the two doses.
Did NACI consult your company prior to issuing its guidance to recommend delaying the second dose by 4 months?
I'm not aware if they have.
So they didn't contact you?
Not as far as I'm aware.
Oh, okay. I didn't expect that. That's frightening. Dr. Granvaux has suggested that the decision to delay the dosing by 4 months is based on assumptions and opinion and not data. In fact, Canada's chief science officer has characterized this decision as, I believe the word she used was human-based or population-based experiment, that it's a clinical trial without consent. Would you agree with that characterization?
I really believe that it's in Canadians' best interest to support whatever national program for vaccination has been determined by the government. But I do agree that differences between different health agencies, and I point to the product monograph that has been agreed to with Health Canada, which assigns a 21-day dose versus the NACI recommendation, which is now 4 months, creates concern, confusion, and potentially hesitancy from certain people within Canada.
Have you relayed these concerns to NACI?
We understand that it is we understand that it is other health professionals' authority to determine what the dose schedule is.
Okay. Were there any other requests for data or information for your company from NACI or any of the members of NACI prior to making this recommendation?
Yeah, I can't comment any further on that.
It's my understanding that another miracle is about to occur from your company. You guys are on top of vaccine boosters addressing potential variants. Impressive. Are you in negotiation with the Canadian government for contracts on any potential boosters for variants?
We've provided a status update on the development program that we're working on. And so we have had conversations about that, but we have not formally begun discussions on boosters as of yet.
Have any other country around the world begun conversations or have established contracts for boosters with Pfizer?
Canada is on par with the rest of the world in discussing the status of both boosters and variants as we continue to evaluate the situation that could be emerging in the future.
Can you update our status on the progress of clinical trials on your vaccine for persons under the age of 18? When will that be complete?
So we are completing right now a study on adolescents between the ages of 12 and 16, and we anticipate to have that data filed here in a couple of months. We will then initiate a program for 5 to 11-year-olds. And we are also currently conducting clinical studies, including here in Canada, for pregnant women. So those 3 studies are underway.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Rample-Garner. We go now to Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher, please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses today who are here sharing their level of expertise. I was as well. Will ask my first question to Mr. Pinault. Mr. Pinault, so there was a lot made, suggesting that Canada wasn't engaged early enough and that we didn't get a good enough deal with your company. And I thought maybe you could just take a few moments to elaborate on how early in the process that we engaged with your company, and maybe the comprehensive, contract that Canada has with Pfizer that led you to actually beating your total dose target for this month.
Mr. Chair, if we could just clarify the second question, I'll respond to the first and then maybe ask the member to clarify exactly what the second question is. As I stated in my opening remarks, when we first identified the opportunity to bring a vaccine to market, we did work collaboratively with the Canadian government. We issued a 5-point letter outlining what Pfizer's commitment was to pursue on multiple levels a response to this pandemic. Part of the challenge that we had as we're comparing to other countries is that the rolling submission process was not in place until September. And so therefore, when we finalized our initial contract with the government in August, we anticipated a timeline that very much looked like Australia, who received approval through their normal regulatory review process in late January and initiated their first vaccination of Pfizer's vaccine in that country in early February. And so it wasn't until mid-November that we identified a pathway that would allow us to bring this product to Canadians in December. And so ever since then, we have been working to accelerate delivery to this country.
I think you kind of touched on the second question there, Mr. Pinault. So when there was a bit of a bump in the road, as we've called it, with the number of vaccines coming in, you did some work at your Belgium plant to enable your company to increase capacity. Can you tell me where you went? Did that double capacity, quadruple it?
We went from 1.3 billion doses on a global basis to 2 billion doses in the month of January and February, concurrent to us making changes to the Belgium facility.
Wow. Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Dubé, I noticed that you are an expert in the socio-cultural impacts of vaccination, and we talk a lot about vaccine hesitancy and the importance of ensuring that people understand that the vaccines that are in Canada, the vaccines that are in the world, are safe and effective vaccines. Can you give us some advice on what we should be doing to ensure that people feel confident in taking these vaccines?
Thanks. So I think the government of Canada is already doing a lot of work through this vaccine confidence task force, a lot of campaign. I think what we face at the moment is an infodemic, so an epidemic of information and communication on top of the pandemic. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of publication around vaccine that generates doubts in the public, and we follow that in our work in Quebec, looking at social media discourses along with traditional media publications. So there's a lot of conflicting information, often a result of clinical trials or portrayed in media without sufficient consideration to all the details that make it difficult for the general public to understand and appraise the recommendation by public health authorities and exactly know what to do.
So if we had one message for Canadians about vaccine hesitancy, are we articulating that clearly enough, in your opinion?
I think there's a lot of good work. I think it's hard to have, from a governmental perspective, it's hard to have a take on what the media are doing. I think one of the major issues is around all the journalists are looking at details around. So I think it's more along those lines. Yeah.
Thank you. Back to Mr. Pinault just for a quick second. You mentioned the rolling submission. How important was that to getting a deal in place for Vaccines for Canada in a timely fashion?
Just to be clear, it wasn't important to get a deal in place. I mean, we had our agreement in place before Health Canada authorize the rolling submission forecast, but it was critical to accelerating and allowing us to bring vaccines to Canada in December.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. We'll go now to Monsieur Thériault. C'est à vous maintenant. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Granvaux, earlier you said that it's important to not release contradictory data. On the issue of the 2 doses in particular, are you aware of Dr. Desseur's study from the ENSPQ? Yes, I have seen it. I see. Does it reassure you as far as the 21-day delay for the second dose is concerned? Because what it seems like that study is showing, unless I'm mistaken, is that to some extent the second dose only extends the effect of the first dose, but that the first dose provides for an 80 to 85% efficacy rate. Now, in the context of a shortage, we were laggards when it came to vaccinations at the beginning. Has that efficacy rate caused concerns among people? Respond. Well, the study that Dr. Besser took part in was a compilation of clinical trial results. And it's a different way of compiling data. What they did is they removed the first 7 days of the data from the clinical trials based on the premise that during that period the vaccine has no effect. And based on that, they determined that the first dose and second dose had similar efficacy. But under that analysis, the fact of the matter is that the number of participants that only received the first dose was highly limited because the study, in fact, was tailored to people who received 2 doses. So it was a very small sample for that data. For that study. But if you look at what's happening out in the field and the data from the United Kingdom, for example, we see a discrepancy in terms of the age groups and efficacy. For example, younger people. But what concerns me is seniors, older people. It gives you a sense of the immunization profile, but it doesn't give you a keen sense of the effect of the second dose over time. So it's very different. It just gives us a sense of when people start to develop their immunization. Question. Well, when it comes to studies, it's hard it's like finding a needle in a haystack. There's data that changes from week to week. Last week, there was an issue with the AstraZeneca immunization for folks over 65, and then there was a study undertaken by Public Health England which demonstrates that the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines have perhaps limited efficacy when it comes to the first dose in certain cases, but when it comes to preventing serious problems and hospitalization, well, they have the same efficacy as other vaccines. So how do we parse this apart, and how do we ensure that folks have confidence? We seem to be caught up in this vaccine race, and we're overwhelmed with information. Companies react or have sometimes knee-jerk reactions to the data coming out of studies, and in an attempt to counter any concerns. But folks at the end of the day are worried. Response. Well, the scientific findings are coming in real time, And normally it takes 10 years to develop a vaccine, and everything's been condensed into a 1-year time frame. All the data is coming in real time, visibly across the world, and is causing a lot of misapprehension. And that's why I said earlier that our decision-making organizations need to be unified, need a common approach. The situation is evolving. Unfortunately, we are laggards when it comes to vaccines vis-a-vis other countries, but we should be using that lag to our advantage. We have data from Israel and from the UK which can be helpful to us. But that data needs to be used by the Public Health Agency of Canada and also by the National Advisory Committee on Immunisation. We need to review that data, update our review every 2 weeks, and we need a unified common approach, in fact, from the same organization, one single organization based on data that comes out from the field. We need to take time to analyze that data every month, every question. But it's the CESQ that will take the decisions in Quebec, correct? Yes, indeed, that is true. I'm sorry about that. But it does add a layer of confusion, doesn't it? Because there are different bodies handling things in different jurisdictions. But were I an optimist, I'd say that the CESQ and the other provincial organizations should work hand in hand with their federal counterpart, but I'm not optimistic. Question, Dr. Dubé, what about... Thank you very much, sir. Unfortunately, Mr. Theriault, your time has run out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll pick up where I left off later.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Pinault, did the Government of Canada attempt to negotiate a licensing agreement to manufacture the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine domestically in Canada?
Mr. Chair, could I ask the member to clarify the timing of the question regarding when we engaged and how we engaged with the government?
Well, I suppose from the moment you started negotiating with the Canadian government about vaccine sales, did they ever request that you produce that vaccine here in Canada?
Yes, they did, but we wanted to move as fast as the speed of science would allow, and having full autonomy over our manufacturing process was vital to be able to do that. Subsequently, just as recently as a month ago, we have undertook a second evaluation of Canadian capabilities to understand if there's a turnkey solution for our vaccine process. And after evaluating 6 manufacturing sites, which the government provided full capability analysis on, we determined that there was not a viable manufacturing facility here in Canada for fill finish that would allow us to quickly transfer our process to be able to produce locally.
Okay, how many countries is Pfizer producing the vaccine in around the world?
Which part of the process? That, Mr. Chair, I'd like to understand which part of the process, because as I provided it in my opening remarks, there's over 19 different countries that are involved in the manufacture of this. If we're specifically talking about fill finish, then we are looking at 2.
Okay, thank you. Now, last week, the US pharmaceutical company Novavax published its vaccine agreement with Canada. This is the only agreement made public so far between the Canadian government and a vaccine manufacturer. In that contract, it specifically permits releasing details for the purposes of government administration in keeping with proactive disclosure laws and, quote, reporting to Parliament. Does Canada's contract with Pfizer contain a similar clause?
The contract with Canada and Pfizer is confidential in nature, and there's only a handful of agreements, one of which you mentioned, that are in the public domain, and each of those has its own purpose behind it. But in the vast majority of agreements between manufacturers and
with respect, Mr. Pinault, I have limited time. I just asked you if it contained that clause. Now the United States has released Pfizer's $1.95 billion vaccine contract with Operation Warp Speed last November. That document confirmed that the U.S. had secured 100 million vaccine doses at a price of $19.50 US per dose. Two questions: how much is Canada paying per dose? And second, if Pfizer permitted the U.S. government to release at least portions of its contract, why can't it release part of its contract with Canada?
So, Mr. Chair, I'd remind the member that in early December, he made a statement at this committee, I believe, that said he was not interested in acquiring commercially sensitive information. And the prices of our contracts are indeed commercially sensitive. We have negotiated those prices country by country, with the exception of the EU, which is all managed under one. And we have included the principles of equity to ensure access. We have a tiered pricing system that is relative to each country's income level, the amount of volume that they've committed, and the delivery schedule that they've asked for. And so,
with respect, Mr. Pinault, you've allowed us to know the price you're paying per dose in the U.S. Is it not commercially sensitive to know that figure?
Mr. Chair, I would remind the member that we have a different story for every country. And so as we're talking about Canada, that price remains confidential.
But with respect, the price is either commercially sensitive or it's not, Mr. Pinault. You can't release it in one country and say it's not commercially sensitive to release the price per dose in the U.S., but it is commercially sensitive to not release the price in Canada. I don't understand that. Let me move on then. According to the Washington Post, Israel was able to accelerate rollout in part by paying US $50 per dose of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, nearly double the price paid by the EU. Did Canada pay a premium for any December deliveries of our vaccine or for any vaccines that we've secured to date?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to remind the member that the US situation is different than Canada, going back to his earlier question and comment, that the US has continuously supported innovation in the life sciences sector, and therefore has a different reason to discuss and potentially disclose relative elements of the contract. And so we would encourage Canada to consider adopting more favorable policies and positions that would foster innovation in the life sciences sector and the biopharmaceutical industry going forward to increase resiliency.
The question, Mr. Pinault, was, did you charge Canada a premium for receiving our doses in December?
The answer is that prices remain confidential.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. So we'll try and shoehorn in a fast second round. So instead of 5-minute slots for the Liberals and Conservatives, we'll go to 4-minute slots and 2-minute slots for the Bloc and NDP. We'll start the next round with, with Ms. Rempel-Garner. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Pinault, in a response to Mr. Fisher, you suggested that you created a pathway for delivery of the vaccine to Canada in December. Did that mean that there wasn't an initial delivery scheduled into the first contract for December?
We were always anticipating a Q1 launch, and assuming that Health Canada gave a favorable review of our dossier.
So we weren't supposed to get doses in December, and we had to renegotiate. Did we have to pay a premium to get those doses in December?
As I responded earlier, prices are confidential.
Interesting.
So we will not
I'm sure it'll come out in the wash someday. You also talked about the fact that you haven't missed a weekly delivery target, but there's been some weeks that we've received 0 vaccines. So are we on a quarterly target or actually a weekly target?
As I mentioned in our opening statements, around the world, including Canada, Pfizer has committed on a quarterly basis what the delivery schedule will be.
Okay, so in your remarks, you've also talked about sort of big batches over the next few quarters. But if we've gone to a 4-month dosing timeline, could that quarterly could that quarterly delivery schedule impact delivery in a 4-month dosing timeline?
The volumes that are in our contract, which we have publicly disclosed, and I'd be happy to reiterate them now, are what determines our delivery schedule.
Okay. So have you given any advice to NACI on matching your delivery schedule to the dosing recommendations?
So as mentioned before, we have not been in touch with NACI.
Okay, I have 2 minutes left, and I'm an economist, not a virologist. So I'd like to go to Dr. Granvaux. What am I missing asking Mr. Pinault?
Well, I think the question that you asked about the contact between NACI and the company is a good one, like and the match between the deliveries and the schedule of vaccination is an important one. I don't think that at this stage Pfizer could be involved at another stage of the discussion. I think, as it was mentioned by Monsieur Pinault, like this is the decision from other regulatory agencies and not for them at this point.
Okay. So, and I just want to, Mr. Pinault, you had mentioned, I think, a very salient point in your comment to me. You said that the change in dosing and the conflicting information between regulatory agencies could lead to concern, confusion, and potentially hesitancy. Would you say that staying to one set of advice is the best way to prevent vaccine hesitancy in this regard, among other issues?
It is Pfizer's belief that the product monograph, which has a 21-day schedule between doses, is the right approach.
Dr. Granvaux, with my last question, are you concerned about potential vaccine-resistant variants occurring due to incomplete dosing?
Absolutely, yes. And that's one of the hypotheses currently, that some of the variants emerge in immunocompromised people because they don't have a full immunity. So that would be the same with the vaccine.
I have 30 seconds left. Do you believe that that could happen in Canada with a 4-month space between the doses of the mRNA vaccines?
We cannot exclude this possibility.
Okay. Do you think this has been factored into NACI's decision in recommending?
No, I don't think so.
That is very disturbing, and I'll end my questions with that.
Thank you, Ms. Rempel-Garner. We'll go now to Mr. Killory. Mr. Killory, please go ahead. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and hello, everyone, and thank you for the witnesses that are here today. Very interesting. I have a short period of time, so I have 2 questions. I'm going to start with Mr. Pinault. Can you provide your views on how to better prepare for the next possible pandemic? So that's going to where the puck is going to be. And my second question to you is Pfizer looking, or is it open to setting up domestic production in Canada?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank the member for the question. To be successful going forward in creating more resiliency here in Canada, the government needs to create conditions which foster innovation and support investment. We're competing on a global stage and are apparently woefully behind our peers. We need to start with incremental support of the life sciences sector by leveraging the strength of discovery and research to build on the rest of the ecosystem, including the role that industry plays in providing its manufacturing expertise and managing global supply chains. Fundamental is an understanding that local market and regulatory conditions do impact and determine our resiliency here in Canada. Some of the lessons learned we have from what's taken place during this pandemic is that years of public policy decisions have made Canada less attractive to investment. PMPRB's flawed regulatory changes impede domestic companies from scaling up without artificial support. There's slow drug listing and processes that have limited or delayed access to new medicines. And there's mediocre IP protection. All of this has taken place without a sincere and collaborative consultation with our industry. And so, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we're here and available to help solve this problem collectively.
Thank you very much. My next question, which will be my last question, is to Dr. Dubé. So Dr. Dubé, in regards to the work, your work on vaccine hesitancy, which is an exceptionally important issue, obviously, today. I guess I'm looking from you, what can governments do? And that's all levels of government, to communicate to Canadians, especially those at risk of COVID-19, about the safety and efficacy of vaccines. What can we be doing now? What can we be doing better to get that out there?
Thanks for the question. As I mentioned earlier, I think the vaccine confidence subgroup of the Government of Canada is doing a great work in starting to communicate. I think what we've missed is that we should have started that much way earlier. This could have been done past summer. I think this left an empty space that the anti-vaccine people have filled out. So that's unfortunate. It's not too late, and I think there's good efforts being done. I agree with my colleagues on the risk of having different recommendations and the confusion out there that could create more hesitancy. I think we need to have unified messages. We need to work with all sectors, the businesses, the religious leader, to have a common messages on the importance and safety of the COVID vaccine that we have in Canada.
Thanks very much. How much time do I have, Chair?
You have 25 seconds.
Okay, I'll just say this, is that somebody mentioned earlier in this testimony on the speed of science, and I think, Dr. Dubé, that ties into your great point around the communication techniques and vehicles that we have to be kind of aligned to the speed of science. So thank you for your points, and thank you for your answers to the question, both you and Mr. Pinot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway. We go back now to Ms. Rempel-Garner. Please go ahead, please, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to go back to Mr. Pinot. Mr. Pinot, with regard to the contract that was originally signed for your vaccine, you said that the deliveries just started with Q1. So I just want to clarify that the Government of Canada did not negotiate delivery of vaccine doses for December of this year. Is that correct? Or last year, is that correct? In the original contract?
That's correct.
When were the doses for December delivery negotiated?
We began negotiating in mid-November when both we and the government identified a potential pathway to an earlier decision and concluded that negotiation in December.
Did the United States have delivery of doses in December negotiated in their original contract?
The benchmarks that are often used, both the UK and the US, both anticipated much earlier in the pandemic a potential pathway for a December authorization. And
okay, so I'll take that as a yes. So at what point did the Government of Canada engage in negotiations with your company for an initial December delivery? On what date?
Sometime in mid-November.
Oh, okay. Did the price that we paid per dose in December, is it higher than what we're paying for deliveries in Q1?
Prices are confidential and we will not be sharing those.
Okay. Wow. All right. I'm going to go back to Dr. Granvaux for a minute to keep talking about the potential for vaccine. Or I want to talk about this concept of consent. So you talked about how the decision to delay dosing by 4 months, there isn't data to support that decision, that it's been based on opinion from NACI and now I guess from Health Canada. Can you talk about what that lack of consent means for people in the general public right now, and any potential other negative impacts that we might not have discussed today that Parliament should be concerned with the change in that dosing schedule?
Yeah, so when you change the dosing like that, that means that you ask the people to take a medication or a vaccine, in this case, in a different posology, and you have to assess the risk and the benefit in this case. And so when you give that to a patient, you have to inform them in details of what will be the benefit for the health and also the potential risk for the health. And in this case, we cannot really give them this informed information because we don't have the data for that.
Can you think of any reason why the minutes of the NACI meetings or the votes of potential members should be held confidential from the public?
Well, no, and I don't think they are. They are just delayed. They are coming weeks after the decisions.
Okay. If this was something that our committee compelled NACI to produce, do you see any reason for that not to happen immediately?
No, that should happen immediately, to my opinion.
Do you see any reason why journalists shouldn't be allowed as part of the NACI deliberations?
No, there is no confidentiality because there was no decision on which vaccine, like contract confidentiality.
Mr. Pinault, did NACI, were they ever in contact with your company?
Over the course of all the business we do, we have engaged with NACI, but as it relates to the current 4-dose schedule or 4-month dose schedule recommendation, we have not been in contact with them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rempel-Garner. We'll go back now to Dr. Pawlowski, please. Doctor, go ahead. 4 minutes.
My question to Mr. Pinault to begin with, you mentioned that the supply chain to make your vaccine includes 86 suppliers in 19 countries. Is Canada one of those 19 countries?
Right now, Canada, a company in Vancouver, was critical in our development of this vaccine by providing IP and a license for that IP that was related to the lipid nanoparticles. So while they are not directly supplying us with any part of the supply chain, their know-how and expertise was critical.
Does having that link give us any advantage in negotiating contracts, i.e., because we were somehow part of developing this, was that reflected in the price we had to pay?
The negotiations and additional details on the negotiations are confidential, and unfortunately I cannot share those details.
Okay. Now I have to say Pfizer did a fantastic job because your company, undoubtedly, there are a lot of people alive today who otherwise wouldn't be alive if you guys hadn't produced your vaccine as quickly as you did. So you certainly get kudos for having done that. Now, you are a company, however, and you have obligation to your shareholders, and you also need to recoup the high costs of developing various drugs. So you have to realize a profit in selling, and particularly in developed countries. I think you're going to probably financially do pretty well out of this. What is Pfizer's attitude towards profits in developing countries? Would you consider the possibility of voluntary licensing or producing and selling vaccines at cost to developing countries?
So as I mentioned earlier, we do have a pricing tier that is reflective of a country's income level. 36% of our contracted volumes are for middle and low income countries, and we have made a 40 million dose commitment to COVAX. We also support the Government of Canada's surplus donation plans that are in place. However, the question around IP, we do not believe that waiving IP is an easy answer to the capacity challenges that we face.
Miguel.
Oftentimes, we've been highlighted that there are more than 3 mRNA vaccines that are currently seeking authorization here in Canada. The biggest bottlenecks are time to development, the manufacturing production, which requires expertise, and the global supply chains, which require procuring very difficult to source materials. So waiving IP is not going to fix solving the current ramp up in production that Pfizer and a number of other companies are going through right now.
Now, you may not want to reveal this either, but the price that you charge to COVAX for the vaccines, I think you said, or you're supplying COVAX with a certain number of vaccines, is that at cost or a minimum profit?
Again, I can't discuss any pricing.
Okay, a quick question, hopefully for Dr. Grandveau. So I know in Ontario, there's a database which links your OHIP number and to your to the vaccine that you got and the time you received it. Also, your OHIP number, and I'm sure you have something similar in Quebec, is linked to test results. So we could theoretically get real-time data by linking these, showing because we'll get results on the variants, and we could link the two so we would know whether the variants were emerging in people who've been vaccinated. So in Quebec, is there any attempt to—
you're at 4 minutes.
Well, let me just finish. Is there any attempt to link this data in Quebec to get real-time data?
Well, I know the system exists to collect this data, but I don't know if they are connected and if people are trying to connect that at the moment in Quebec.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Nous allons maintenant à Monsieur.
Mr. Lemieux, Bloc Québécois. Mr. Lemieux, please go ahead. You have 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't hear the interpretation, but it's my understanding that you gave me the floor. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Pinault. First, congratulations to Pfizer for their leadership and for having won the vaccination or vaccine race. Supply and demand, is that a factor that will have an impact on the price of a vaccine in the pharmaceutical industry, please?
Pfizer has been on record from the beginning to say that traditional supply and demand economics do not factor into our pricing decision.
Est-ce qu'on peut penser?
Could one be forgiven for thinking that a vaccine bought by the Government of Canada or another country in the last quarter of 2020 would cost more or less than the summer of 2021, for example, when there might be a less demand?
Again, I appreciate the question, but we will not be discussing pricing publicly.
Donc,
Well, I just want to understand if there was some rationale there. Ms. Dubé, do you think that Canada paid a lot to symbolically enter into this vaccine race? You know, Canadians, according to CBC, Radio-Canada and other media outputs or outlets, are being vaccinated at a slower rate than those abroad in some countries. Is it too expensive compared to the price in Europe, for example? That's a good question. It's a little bit, it's not really within my purview, but like in every country in the world, the vaccine is seen as a solution to putting an end to the pandemic. So there's been a gold rush, if you will, to produce this vaccine. Well, that has been to the disadvantage of taxpayers, as far as I'm given to understand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Merci, Monsieur Lemieux. We go now to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, please go ahead, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Pinault. You brought up the PMPRB changes. We know that those reforms which your company opposes were scheduled to go into force on January 1st of this year, and the Liberal government postponed them for the third time. Tell me, at any time in 2020, did Pfizer ever link the provision of vaccine doses with its desire to have the government not implement the PMPRB changes?
Let me be clear, the answer is never.
Thank you. Did Pfizer permit the release of the contract with the United States? Was that by agreement, Mr. Pinault?
Again, I can't speak to other countries and the unique circumstances that led to disclosures for Pfizer or any other company.
Will you agree to release the contract over the Canadian government? Will you waive confidentiality, at least for non-sensitive, non-commercially sensitive aspects, so that Canadians can see the contract?
Pfizer has provided an unprecedented level of transparency. We've openly shared details of our clinical program. We've published data in peer-reviewed journals, and we've shared our manufacturing targets and performance against them. Excuse me. This
okay,
balances the need to keep the details
You're not answering the question,
confidential.
so my last question will be, Argentina and other countries, they claim that Pfizer is using its patent monopoly to try to force provisions in contracts, avoiding liability for negligence, fraud, or malice. Is such a clause in the Canadian contract?
Again, terms and conditions of the Canadian contract should remain confidential.
Can you tell us why they should?
Because of the geopolitical sensitivities, as I mentioned earlier, we've negotiated with each country outside of the EU on an individual basis, given its unique circumstances. Diving into the details of contracts will not bring vaccines to Canada any quicker. And so we strongly recommend that we keep these contracts confidential.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. And that wraps up round 2. And that brings our meeting today to a close. Thank you to the witnesses and to all the members. And with that, we are adjourned.